Well, wonderful. As we start to reach critical mass, I'd like to go ahead and get us kicked off here. Real quickly, my name is Jennifer Stokes. I'm the Managing Director of Development at RMI. And as I look at our attendees, I have had the privilege to talk with so many of you. So thank you for joining us for this discussion today to talk with our team about the work that we've been doing on the Inflation Reduction Act and really hear a bit of a behind the scenes of what's been happening at RMI the past couple of months. I want to make sure that this is an active conversation, so please do use the Q&A function. We have a short presentation, but then we will be turning it over to the questions from those that are attending, and that will be the majority of the time that we spend today. We will end at the top of the next hour, so you can get on to what else you're doing during the day. I want to quickly introduce Stephanie Green. She is our Managing Director of our Carbon-Free Buildings program. Prior to joining RMI, Stephanie held a number of positions at PG&E and has deep expertise in vehicle electrification as well as in building decarbonization. Stephanie's team has also been quite involved, and she will be moderating the conversation between Sarah and John. We have a number of other RMI staff that are here and other panelists. And so if we have a question that our folks can't answer, we will turn it over to them. So thank you again for joining us. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and for your ongoing commitment to the clean energy transition. We are so thrilled that the Inflation Reduction Act has been signed into law. So the IRA will make it cheaper to upgrade our homes and our businesses while providing healthier indoor air quality and reducing climate pollution. So my carbon-free buildings team works side by side with our US policy team, which has grown really significantly during the past few years in preparation for this very moment. And we've been very closely involved in the development of this legislation. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce two leaders on the US policy team. So first, Sarah Ladislaw is our managing director leading our US policy program. She works on other global initiatives like the Mission Possible Partnership to reduce industrial sector emissions and support the development of green banks. Sarah was also previously the Senior Vice President and Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And before CSIS, Sarah worked in the Office of the Americas in the US Department of Energy's Office of Policy and International Affairs, where she covered a range of economic, political, and energy issues in the Western Hemisphere. John Cookett is our Director of US Government Affairs, where he leads RMI's federal policy team. John was previously the Director of Federal and International Campaigns at the Sierra Club, where he worked on the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal, Clean Transportation, and Dirty Fuels campaigns. And before the Sierra Club, John worked at Greenpeace on their international climate change team. So Sarah and John will give a brief overview of the IRA and, most importantly, what comes next. Because while the IRA is a huge win, our real impact is going to be in the implementation. So our next steps are really critical. Please feel free along the way to just go ahead and submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I'll turn it over now to Sarah and John.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephanie. And hi, everybody. It's really great to be here with all of you today. Before getting started on the presentation, I did just want to add my thanks to what Jennifer said. Just a huge thank you to so many of you for your support and partnership in getting to this historic moment. As John's going to talk to you as his part of the presentation, our team of experts across RMI worked pretty hard over the last several years to inform and support the creation and passage of this legislation. But it was work that we did really closely with many of you and other critical stakeholders in the climate community. So it really was a team effort. So really thanks across the board. But there's a lot more work to do, so let's get started. I'm just going to make three quick key points about the Inflation Reduction Act in the context of other federal policymaking over the last couple of years, really just to drive home what an important moment this is for U.S. policymaking and U.S. climate. My 3 points are really, really simple. The IRA investment is big. It's sophisticated policy, and it's going to have an enormous impact on greenhouse gas emissions and potentially the shape of the U.S. clean energy industry. But, to maximize its achievements, we really need to do some additional work. So let's get started with the next slide. Okay, so it's a big investment. The IRA itself, which is the teal bar on that far right-hand side at $369 billion, is at least 3 times bigger than the American Recovery and Investment Act, and it's about as big as the European climate package. So whether it's in US or historical context, this is a lot of money and it's big investment. But as this new RMI analysis on this slide shows, when you add it together with a fully funded CHIPS and Science Act, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, depending on what you want to call it, the federal investment over the coming decade could represent a 3.5 times increase over the previous decade, which is a 15 times increase greater than federal climate investment in the 1990s and the 2000s. So this is really a sea change in the amount of money that we're seeing the federal government invest into climate. It could also possibly be much bigger than that and more impactful. You take into consideration that these 3 bills alone don't count all of the other federal investment that is being mobilized by the Biden administration, all of government approach to climate. And also tax credits, some of them, as John's going to talk about, aren't capped. So it could be, the investment could be much higher. It's also sometimes really hard to approximate how much additional investment these investments are going to be able to leverage. Take, for example, the DOE Loan Program Office Guarantee Authority, and things like the new Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or Green Bank that could potentially be able to catalyze huge amounts of additional funding in how those programs are implemented. Next slide, please. It's sophisticated policymaking. And so if you take these 3 pieces of legislation together and you look at the way that the funding is spread across various portions of the S-curve technology adoption cycle, which is represented on this slide, you see that it's spread out all the way from innovation to mass deployment, which is really critically important because, as the International Energy Agency has told us, of the 400 technologies that we need for the world to align with our net zero pathway, 60% of those are not yet commercially available. So by 2050, approximately half of our emissions reductions are likely to come from technologies that are only in prototype or demonstration stages today. So this type of comprehensive investment that goes all the way from the beginning of the innovation cycle through to deployment is really a breakthrough for US policymaking. The other sophisticated parts of this legislation that aren't necessarily represented on this slide are not just about driving technologies, into the market with no regard for communities and people. Lots of this legislation includes important labor and environmental justice provisions that, if they're implemented well, can help make sure that clean energy jobs are good jobs and that communities that need to benefit from the transition the most see those benefits. So on a multitude of levels, this is the most sophisticated energy policy I've ever seen, working on this for about 20 years. Next slide, please. And as many of you have seen, there's a numerous number of studies out there. This one is from the REPEAT project, showing the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions reduction between sort of 40 and 42% below 2005 levels by 2030. So not quite as much as what we anticipated getting from Build Back Better, but just so much further than we would have gotten without this legislation. It still leaves a gap for what the US wants to achieve by 2030 to get its target. But to be candid, it's a much smaller gap, and momentum to fill that gap is much stronger now as a result of some of the changes that can take place because of this legislation. Next slide. And according to recently released Department of Energy analysis, the 1 gigaton reduction made possible by both the IRA and the bill will predominantly come from the power sector emissions reduction, followed by industry, buildings, transport, agriculture, and forestry. And John's going to talk to you a little bit about the provisions that are driving those emissions reductions. Next slide. And finally, this bill is going to make clean energy solutions even cheaper, which can have really, really important market and investment implications, but it can also help to justify the cost of compliance against existing environmental regulation and potentially future regulation as well. So it really enables potentially a sea change in the cost of compliance in getting to our clean energy transition. But the bill also begins to address the fact that clean energy supply chains need to become more robust, more resilient, and start to include more of our neighbors and friends and allies. And by encouraging clean energy manufacturing at home, we can build additional domestic support for these technologies and provide enhanced energy security and resilience, which is part of why we think it has real potential long-term bipartisan appeal as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to John, and he'll talk about the details of the IRA provisions and how they accomplish all of this. John?
Next slide. So as Sarah just mentioned, the bulk of the reductions come from the programs that impact the electric sector. The primary, I guess, policy you'd say that drives those reductions is the extension of the tax credits. That was the big piece that everyone was pushing for, and it's in the bill. The thing that I think is important, though, to point out is that it doesn't just extend the tax credit, it changes them substantially for the better. There are a couple of really key pieces. One is that we get PTC optionality for solar. That allows utilities to take direct, to option that the tax credits more easily. It fits in their investment structure. And there's a change to make the tax credit transferable to them. There's also a big change that allows for direct pay for co-ops and munis and other nonprofit entities, which is a huge change and will make a big difference for those, especially for the co-ops who've really not been able to take very good advantage of the tax credits in the past. In addition to that, there are two really important programs that sort of sit on top of those utility and co-op programs. These are what we call 1706, which we clearly need to rename, which gives DOE $5 billion in investment subsidy that translates into about $250 billion in loan guarantee authority to help utilities transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy. It also allows for a few other options, but that's primarily what the utilities want to do. And there's almost $10 billion grant program for co-ops to transition as well. Those two programs, we think, dramatically expand the expected emission reductions from the plan. And the 1706 program we're particularly proud of. We worked very hard, first with the House, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and then I think, well, we got the piece into the bill, but I think we did a really good job of managing the dynamic with Senator Manchin around those two provisions. We kept our head down. We were flexible as some of the language changed. We worked carefully with the House committee, and in the end, they made it through to the final signed bill. I kind of still can't believe that worked out that way, but it did, and we're super proud of it. There's also a new provision for storage. They get an ITC with normalization opt-out, which means it's much easier for utilities to use. So the last piece that we're highlighting here is something we didn't work on as much, but is a potentially incredibly powerful tool, which is the investment tax credit for community solar reaches up to 50% under this bill if the projects are done in low-income communities. It's an incredibly large change to that provision, and we think when coupled with some of the other provisions, potentially the Green Bank could really drive deployment. So next slide. So this is just a quick chart on the total emission reductions across the utilities sector. You've probably seen these big pieces that show the reductions that come from extension of the tax credits and those other pieces. Many of the modelers had some difficulty modeling in 1706, partly because it was a new provision to them. We did some modeling, and we think it increases the electricity reductions by about 50%. So it's a really big additional program, and we're excited to see the loan office move forward with it. They're very excited about it. The Rural Utilities Service at Department of Ag is very excited about the provision that they got. It gives them almost 10 billion in grants. So between the two of them, we think it'll make a huge difference. Next slide. So the industrial programs in this bill are sprawling and overlapping, and I won't spend a huge amount of time on all of them, except to say that this is probably the biggest change in climate policy that we see in this bill. In the past, we've really focused on renewable energy deployment, the industrial sector, cars, but this bill really includes dramatic pieces that will decarbonize the industrial sector, onshore production of really key clean energy components. There's also in here are some of the pieces that explain why we think this act is actually substantially bigger than the score. The first is the hydrogen production tax credit, scored at 9 billion. It is definitely going to end up driving more deployment than that. It's a very rich $3 tax credit, which we think will make some uses of hydrogen cost effective almost immediately. There's also a new advanced manufacturing production tax credit. We're super excited about that, particularly the battery piece, which we spent a lot of time working on right up until the last minute when it was added to the bill. Those tax credits will make a huge difference for the electric vehicle provision. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then another one that's just shocking to me is there's a methane reduction program. There's actually a fee on methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. Another thing that surprisingly Senator Manchin allowed through in the final bill. And then there are several pieces here, an advanced energy production credit, which was actually a Manchin-Stabenow piece, and then a few other industrial deployment programs that really add up to substantial amounts of money. There's a green bank that will fund NGO investment in clean energy around the country, including at the state green banks. And there's some additional purchase supports for low carbon goods, both at the Department of Transportation and at GSA. And also, of course, the big expansion of the carbon sequestration tax credit and the direct air capture credit. And those, I think, will match up nicely with the subsidies that are in the bipartisan bill. So next slide. So just quickly on domestic battery manufacturing, there's some challenges associated with the EV tax credit, some new requirements that were added. This substantially lessens the blow for that. For vehicles that are where the battery packs are manufactured in the US, the tax credit, this tax credit will add up to almost 2/3 of the total EV tax credit. And if the companies are able to manufacture subcomponents and critical materials, it'll get even larger than that. As you can see right now, cells and packs are manufactured in the US to a reasonable degree, but the critical materials and subcomponents are not at all. Next slide. So the other huge provision is the hydrogen production tax credit. We believe that it'll abate almost 80 million metric tons. The abatement comes if the hydrogen is used in the sectors where it actually decarbonizes, but you'll see here steel, ammonia uses, which is really fertilizer, refineries are some of the obvious targets, as are shipping and trucking and aviation, which would obviously require vehicles that can use the fuel. Next slide. So in the buildings, there are tax credits, which are highlighted here. They include these updated home tax credit 45L, which now is available to the low-income LIHTC credits. So that's a huge improvement. In fact, the building section, there are a lot of pieces where low-income housing gets a bump, or in this case, new access to an existing tax credit. We're really happy that it worked out that way. And next slide. There are two really important new rebate programs. There's an energy efficiency home rebate program that we really worked to get across the finish line that's up to $8,000 for home heat pumps. And then a home performance, sort of whole home rebate program. These are both state-run programs. States will have to set up the programs soon and allow for direct rebates to consumers. And then final piece here. And then there's all this additional funding to make this work. Building code money, money for HUD to advance solutions, contractor training. It's really, this act is really a quite sprawling piece of legislation, and it includes a number of really important supports for the higher profile pieces. So next slide. So here's what we see as the outcome of that. The home rebate, electrification rebate program, we think will impact about 2.4 million homes. The home energy efficiency piece will impact about 1.3 million. And then there's the tax credits, which, they're uncapped. So, it depends on deployment, but they could result in millions of retrofitted commercial real estate and millions of heat pumps installed. Where everyone is starting to look at how we can make sure that that deployment happens at the largest possible scale. So next slide. And then the last piece is transportation. The transportation outcome was the most complicated piece. The EV tax credit is improved in many ways, but also has some very difficult requirements that the auto companies will have to meet. There's also a new used EV tax credit, which we're really excited about, and another $1 billion for heavy duty vehicles. There's $3 billion for UPS to clean up their purchase program to add EVs to that. Remember, that was only an $11 billion program in the first place. And then there's sort of a loophole around the EV tax credit provision where commercial vehicles can take advantage of the same $7,500 credit or a $40,000 credit for heavy duty vehicles. And that has fewer restrictions than the EV credit. And then the sustainable aviation credit is increased substantially to, well, it's a new tax credit, sorry, to $1.75 for really clean, but $1.25 for fuels that cut emissions in half. Next slide. So here's the real positive side of the EV tax credit overall, or overhaul. The most important thing is it removes the manufacturing cap limits, so companies can get the tax credit for all the cars that they make that are eligible. The previous tax credit, something like 75% of Americans were unable to take advantage of it because they didn't have the tax liability. This turns it into a point of sale rebate. It also creates a new program for used vehicles. Next slide. So let me just say one more thing about the tax credit, if we can back up. So the important thing here is that all those things are true, but it is also the case that there's now a pretty difficult manufacturer requirement that the vehicles and batteries be built in the US. And on top of that, there are income caps for how much people can earn to use the tax credit, and there are limits on how expensive the vehicle can be. What we expect to see is companies, and we hear that this is the case, that companies are working very hard to try to come up with vehicles that comply with all of these requirements. The whole tax credit really begins in earnest next year, and we'll see if anyone can find a way to meet the requirements in the first year. But again, if they don't, they have access to the battery manufacturing tax credit if they're manufacturing the batteries in the US, and that substantially cushions that challenge. So back to Sarah. Next slide.
Great. Well, while we wait for, here you go, here I am. Thanks, John. That was really super helpful. So as we said at the outset, this is an enormous amount of investment and new programs and extension of existing programs. And a lot of it was done through a reconciliation process, which means that implementation matters quite a bit. And it varies, pretty considerably in different programs. And we, like many of you, have spent a lot of time over the last several weeks trying to think about in each of these programs, what are the next steps? And really want to, have a robust discussion about that with many of you based on some of the programs and interests that you have, and are certainly having a lot of conversations with our partners across the board as well. I would say, in general, we can bucket the follow-up into two basic categories. And one is to make sure that the programs themselves are implemented in ways that really maximize their value, and that we think about the various sort of provisions and definitions and interpretations where that will be the case, and how they're taken up in different places. So we just listed a few of them here. As John had mentioned, making sure that, gas, we sort of block and tackle on gas and building rebates and tax credits, which, Stephanie can talk a little bit more about. And I think there were some questions about in the chat. That we support robust usage of this new commercial vehicle EV tax credit through greater awareness and implementation, that we understand the existing supply chain constraints and work with economic development agencies to identify opportunities. This is something that we've been planning for, as we knew it would be an issue in implementation ever since we started talking about this, these provisions. And then obviously working with DOE Loan Program Office on both 1706 and the build out of low carbon steel and cement. And there's more areas as well. So these are just some of the things that we're thinking about tackling in terms of making sure things are implemented well. And then on the second sort of category, a lot of this has to do with what are the follow-up, federal regulatory steps that need to be that not only need to be made, but also can be supported because some of the provisions in this bill make it more cost-effective to do it. So tightening federal standards on power plants and vehicles. Also, really making sure that we have ambitious state and local commitments to following up and taking advantage of some of these programs. That was work we were already doing in the context of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and will be continued and expanded for implementation of IRA as well. And then finally, really locking in private sector leadership. I think the important point here is that this bill can help catalyze a huge amount of additional investment from the private sector. And we really want to make sure the private sector is a partner in making sure that that happens in the most effective ways possible. It should go without saying that there are barriers here. And I think many of us have been spending a lot of time talking about what some of those things are. And sometimes, the permitting reform discussion, the workforce discussion, siting discussions, awareness discussions, all these types of things can be barriers to the proper implementation of many of these programs and keep them from realizing their ultimate benefit. And so we'll be spending a lot of time thinking program by program, specifically focused on many of the ones that you could see throughout the presentation. We were really focused on in the run up to the passage of this legislation, and just making sure implementation goes as smoothly as possible. So I'm going to stop there, and I think the intention now is to turn and take some questions from Stephanie and then maybe the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and John, for that overview. And so we're going to dive into some specific questions now that I'm going to start with a few, and then we're going to go into the audience questions. Thank you all. Please continue to populate in the Q&A. So first, let me start with a question for you, John. So there's definitely no mistaking that the IRA is a really massive and unprecedented level of investment and a huge win for climate progress. But it's really what we do and how we implement this investment that's really going to shape our future. So John, what do you see as the biggest challenges that we face in implementing the IRA? And with a really critical window of time to make an impact, what's the single biggest next step that RMI is taking?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge going forward is the short timeline to actually take advantage of most of these programs. Some of them actually start phasing out in 5 years, and the shortage of staffing at the government side of all of this. They're moving incredibly quickly, and I think they're really doing their best. I'm hearing nothing but really positive reports about how engaged they are and how quickly they're trying to get materials out and avoid lengthy delays with rulemakings and so on. But I think the staffing issue is huge. I think there'll be a real desire to sequester some people into the federal government as much as possible. I think the other problem is going to be just getting the word out, because these tax credits and all these programs need people to apply for them, and those things need to be developed and pushed forward. And there's also just sort of a human challenge on the developer side as well. I think RMI is in a decent position to help with that. Unlike most environmental groups, we're staffed with people who can do that kind of thing, and we have former project developers on staff and other people who understand that, but I think that's going to be a really big challenge, especially if in some of the spaces where the projects are big and complex and may require environmental impact statements and so on. So I think those are the two biggest challenges. But I think there's a lot of money on the table here for people to advance big projects, and I think that'll, should speed things up substantially.
Great. That's really helpful, John. Thank you. So now I'll turn to you, Sarah. There are so many positives in the bill, but some are concerned that there are elements of it that will actually slow climate progress. So how do you respond to those concerns?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think everybody has been trying to sort of temper their enthusiasm for all the positive things with the trade-offs that were made to be able to get, a bill of this complexity and magnitude across the line. I will say on a personal level, I feel like there's, if you look at what the potential, say, like oil and gas leasing provisions might actually yield from a greenhouse gas impact implication, it's not huge, right? I mean, if you look at the repeat, sort of modeling that we showed you before, it's roughly within like a band of like a 2% of what the emissions reduction would be, not even just for the provisions in the bill, but sort of like the potential variance across oil and gas production, over the lifetime of the modeling, right? And so I do think we need to sort of take it with a grain of salt to say, if you look at all of the things we're doing to promote all the positive things we need for greenhouse gas reduction on the clean energy side relative to this oil and gas, leasing provisions, there's still a lot to be done in the implementation of those as well. And if just on a purely greenhouse gas basis, right, it's not as big of an impact, certainly by order of magnitude. What's the impact on communities that don't want that kind of, production around them or in their area or in federal, leasing? That's a whole different issue. And I think we still have many, many areas where we can take up that issue and deal with that in the coming years. So just like we have lots to do in implementation of all the positive things, we also have lots to do to deal with all of the implementation of the other types of provisions as well. I'll also say that, there's a lot of parsing that we need to do and commitments we need to make that, to look at the environmental justice and worker transition components of this bill, right? I gave it a lot of credit for being innovative, and the fact that we do have a lot of new programs, provisions, and money that are put towards communities of a bunch of different varieties to be able to make sure that this is a transition that is good for those communities. That being said, we don't have a good track record, and we have to be extremely honest about, the fact that some of these policies and the programs and implementation are really quite hard to do, that our knowledge base is not where it needs to be, and that we need to really, double down on making sure that those investments do all of the right things that they're supposed to, and as they were intended in inclusion in the law. So it's not like a slam dunk on like, hey, there's no big problems in the bill. I just think we need to pay attention to both the goods and the bads and maximize the benefits for everybody.
Great. That's really helpful. Thank you, Sarah. So John, what comes next for federal policymaking after this?
Well, leaving aside the implementation, which we'll talk about more, I'm sure, and we've talked about a little bit, I think the next big thing federally is going to be a suite of mostly EPA standards that have been sitting around for a while, and it's really time for those to move forward. The administration was waiting for a Supreme Court decision. They were waiting to see whether this bill would go forward. They have both of those now, and it's time to move forward. It makes a huge difference to the implementation of this if EPA puts forward strong standards for cars, for power plants. There are things that they can do on the building side. So when you put all that together, it's a really important nudge for the implementation of the rest of the bill, and it could really tip the scales, especially around coal going forward. I think there's no doubt that the agency is trying to get those done, but it's been much slower than we had hoped.
Great, thank you. And I see there's a lot of questions in the chat, so this is going to be our last question, pre-populated, and then we're going to go to the audience Q&A. So Sarah, which provision in the bill has the biggest potential for impact and has you most excited?
It's a really good question. I think it's hard to say at this point, because I think the question is, what do you mean by impact? And I will say, and this again is part and parcel of the US strategy at RMI, which is, listen, clean energy is not just good for the climate. Like, it's the biggest potential strategic thing the US could do for the future of our economy and leadership globally on this issue, right? I mean, it is good for our communities. It's good for public health. It's good for our, economic well-being. It has, a lot of, really important international leadership dimensions to it as well. And so, I think that the thing that I get really excited about in this bill is it's the first time I've seen us do something that's close enough to the scale and the complexity of creating that kind of leadership dynamic in the US, right? This bill has the ability to completely change the narrative about what it means to, invest in clean energy in the US, because it basically makes it all possible to show up in people's communities, right? We've been saying this narrative for a long time, and I give the Biden administration and different members of Congress real credit for saying, hey, clean energy is an economic opportunity as much as it is, something we need to be doing for the climate. But it didn't resonate in people's communities. People didn't see real economic development being generated as a result of these investments in a way that just made it, part and parcel of how they think about, how their community is developing and how investments are occurring. And I think because of the nature and the breadth of this bill and the duration of the bill as well, it really makes it possible for us to change that once and for all. And so I think I can't pick a provision because I like the complementary nature of all of them. And I just am really excited because I think it is a genuine potential tipping point.
That's great. It's really well said, Sarah. And that is also why I am so excited, certainly in the building sector, seeing the number of local job opportunities to be created for all the contractors and builders that need to help install these new energy efficient appliances. I think it's amazing and so wonderful as a next step in our climate movement. So, okay, I'm going to go to audience questions, and thank you all for advancing. I think we have over 40 or 45 questions so far, so I'll do my best to cluster them together, and then we'll follow up at the end. We are not going to get through everything, but let me start with one about partnerships. So how is RMI partnering with other green NGOs to follow through on oversight and drafting new policies to go further?
Want me to get that one, Sarah? So I think pretty much every major piece of this bill is going to see a green group coalition come together to advocate for the outcomes that we all want. I know that that's true around the hydrogen production tax credit. There's an open question as to what qualifies as green. It's complicated and technical, but it sort of comes down to it needs to be entirely renewable energy. But the details really matter there. There's a coalition working together on that. There's a coalition working together to advance the 1706 provisions I talked about. There's a coalition working on IRS rules around the tax credits. There's, this happens sort of naturally from the groups that work together to advance the provisions in the first place. But, I think it's going to be a lot of coalition work to get this across the finish line. It's just really hard for the administration to have to parse through competing ideas on how these things should work. If we can come to the same conclusion and provide a united front, it's way more likely that the outcome will go our way. Of course, there's a lot of industry out there pushing for solutions that work for their business plan, and that will be the challenge. But I think the the NGOs at least will work together, and that we'll have to because there's so many things to tackle.
Stephanie, if I can just add to that
Yeah.
really quickly, I think John is exactly right. I think what is sort of daunting and good at the same time is that as many coalitions as there are on sort of like the federal implementation side, I think the other sort of strength that RMI is bringing to the table, but quite frankly, we all need to get really serious about really fast, is like bringing these solutions into the locations where people are making investments, right? Like these need to get to the market in the best and most efficient and most productive ways possible. And this is where, like Stephanie, obviously, like your team's got huge, numbers of partnerships across the country in places where you're working to make sure that these things are being taken advantage of. But we're also trying to create new partnerships as well, right? So we've never had this kind of like clean energy industrial development plan in the United States, right? It's just not something we've done in, like, when you think about building out clean energy supply chains, in a very, very long time. And we just really need to think about, how do we make sure that the workforce is there to do it? How do we make sure that these projects are taking place in ways that are really catalytic for the clean energy development potential in different regions? And so we are starting to think about, do we have all of the additional partners that we need for all of the places where we're going to be building some of these things out? And this has already been underway in our engagement with the implementation of, hydrogen hubs, or thinking about, where we're going to prioritize transmission infrastructure, through the carbon-free electricity program, but also just thinking about how do we get economic development officials, as we mentioned on one of the decks, like to really think about what this new package of federal incentives look like and how they continue to attract investment to these spaces so that we can really, sort of build out the opportunity even more. So I think there's additional coalitions and partnerships that we're thinking about building to make sure that the deployment of these programs goes as quickly and smoothly as possible.
Great. Thank you both. This is really insightful and helpful. And I think I'm going to switch now to a couple different questions that came up around incentives for municipalities and local governments. So can you tell a little bit more about the equal financial incentive treatments for municipalities, public power, schools, cooperatives, and how do we make sure, are there any like cost share requirements in the local government? How do we make sure that city budgets and those from schools and munis, et cetera, can actually execute on these wonderful new provisions?
Yeah, so we've been talking about this one a little bit internally. So the change to direct pay for universities, cities, nonprofits is just astonishing. It means that they will be able to install, say, solar on their facilities. They don't have to go through any complicated tax requirement. They just get a refund on the investment that they make. It's simple, it's efficient, and it's a complete game changer for those kinds of institutions. And there'll be lots of webinars like this talking those kinds of organizations through it, but it's a huge improvement. On the, as far as when we saw the piece pop up about sharing the costs, I don't think there's anything like that in here. I mean, obviously, if the tax credit is a third, there's effectively a 2/3 cost share, but there aren't those kinds of cost shares are not part of this. It's mostly tax policy. So it's just a benefit that you get if you make the investment. Obviously, institutions can borrow money to cover the costs, and for the most part, these tax credits cover a third to a half of the remaining cost.
Great, thanks. Okay, there's a lot of questions about buildings and HVAC, which I'm very excited to see here. Let's see if I can kind of cluster some of them together. The first is, it sounds like there's some interest in, let's talk first about lower income populations and the benefits that people get for credits for insulating and upgrading HVAC. How exactly will this get implemented? And the questions are like, is it up to each state, and will people need taxable income, and how will this process get finalized? And maybe one of you can get started. I'm happy to weigh in as well.
I was hoping you were going to answer this question.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, essentially, here, let me get started and then we can go. So, okay, so a couple of things. So there's a difference here between there's rebates, there's rebates that are actually just like direct incentives. And then there are tax credits. So there are, for people lower and moderate income, so 150% or lower than area median income, people can get incentives up to $14,000 for insulation, electric panel upgrades, heat pump installations, all of the things you need to make a highly energy efficient all electric home. And that is not a tax credit. So you don't need a tax liability to do that. And that's a direct incentive. And it is going to be up to the states for implementation. And so the states need to submit a plan to the federal government, to the DOE, and then they have up to 2 years to implement that plan. But we think and we hope that's some of the work we need to do, right? Is my team, other RMI teams, we're already out in a bunch of states working with policymakers on buildings policy. And so this is something that we can do to really push the states to get these programs out there, to get them implemented in a way that's easy, that's like more like a one-stop shop, right? So that instead of just like, here's my 14K of incentives and it's really hard to apply for, how do you braid and stack those funds with other existing provisions in the states? And how do you make it as easy as possible? So that's all the kind of implementation work that's coming next. But yeah, the short answer is it's not in place tomorrow. The states are going to have to actually do that implementation. And then there was another related question in the chat about the tax credits. And so those are not in place until Jan 1, 2023. So yeah, if you were planning on getting a tax credit for something, I'd wait until that Jan 1, but you're welcome to start researching your options now. John, did you want to add more color on that? Okay, great.
No, I think that's great.
Okay, and then I'm trying to look at some, let's see, if for the heat pump tax rebates, if a project is under construction now, can a person obtain those rebates? And I think I'll lump that in with another question of like, if you're a commercial real estate owner and you've been hesitant to retrofit an older building to be greener and cleaner, like what in this is going to be helpful for you to retrofit an older building. So the question was divided into two: is one, what happens if you have a project that's already under construction? And two, what happens if you're considering doing a retrofit or energy efficiency upgrade to a building?
Well, I think the short answer is that for building retrofits, if you haven't already started and paid for things, now is the time to begin to plan those projects, because as we all know, none of that stuff happens all that quickly, and 2023 is just around the corner. There are credits, there are programs for commercial upgrades for sure, and I think the question is how much of this can all be stacked together. And then the other thing that I would just point out is that there's also a big green bank investment coming through EPA to states and nonprofits that can also invest in this kind of work, both the building sector as well as the renewable energy pieces that may or may not go with communities, particularly in low-income communities. So I think when you stack all that together, there's a ton of opportunity to not only for people wanting to retrofit their individual facilities, but just more broadly for broader programs with companies aimed at taking advantage of these programs across multiple buildings. I think there's a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is an opportunity for building owners and portfolio owners to take a hard look at their portfolios and figure out what they qualify for under their state. And that, like, John mentioned it earlier, but like under the energy efficient commercial buildings deduction 179D, like you have a tax credit, it's good for the next 10 years. It provides tax credits to commercial buildings that achieve at least a 25% reduction in site EUI, energy use intensity. And so like this is huge. Like this is a really wonderful opportunity. You also have the new energy efficient home tax credit 45L. And so these are things that will really change the economics and change the game for highly efficient homes, meeting Energy Star, zero energy ready homes requirements. And it's a great way to reevaluate the economics of your whole portfolio. Okay, so I'm going to move away from buildings to equitable expenditure. So how can we ensure that money will be spent effectively and fairly? And the example given here is $35 billion to NRCS of USDA. How do we make sure that there's fair expenditures that come out of this?
Don, do you want to take that one?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm not as familiar with the USDA program, so I'll leave that to you, John, if you want. But I will say, I mean, across the board, I think that there are a number of different programs for which, because it's a reconciliation bill, right, there's a lot of detail that's going to be determined in implementation. And so like a lot of the, as I was saying before on some of the equity provisions, like how they're being implemented and what some of the details are of it for new programs is really going to matter a lot. But I'm not familiar with that particular one, John. So.
And I think the bigger challenge on equity is going to, or the big challenge on equity is going to be, what to do if people don't come forward with projects that really address the equity issue. If there's a 50% tax credit for community solar projects in low-income communities, but if people don't develop those projects, it's going to be a real challenge for, if EPA wants to use the green bank to try to fund them, and obviously the tax credit won't get used. So I think in the implementation of all of this, it's really on the environmental community, the EJ community, and others to make sure that these programs that are designed to address this challenge are really utilized. And I'm very hopeful that that will happen. You see little glimmers of the fact that people are very focused on it and want to take advantage of it, but it's definitely not a done deal just because a tax credit exists.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask a question about EVs, and then I'm going to jump to a question about philanthropy. So can you talk a little bit more about the EV incentives? Are they going to be limited by make or model? Like, will bolts be eligible, or US content? Like the new EV incentives, or just to be clear, sorry, I'm referring to the used EV incentives compared to the new EV incentives. That's what the question says, which is, are they going to be limited, the used ones, by make model? And then how will credits and rebates for used EVs be handled?
So the used EV tax credit, there's no like Buy American or anything like that. The requirement is just an income requirement for the purchase of the vehicle. And then there's also limits on how often the car can be sold. So you can't buy it, sell it to your wife and have her sell it to your kid. But there are actual, but that's the main, that's the requirement on that. So it should be something that gets used as compared with the more challenging new car credits.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to switch to a question about philanthropy. So we're so pleased to see so many of you on this call. Sarah, I'm going to ask you a question, which is, do you think that the IRA will change where and how philanthropy can best advance climate and energy work? And a related question is, how can small foundations help bring this to fruition? What's the best leverage point besides giving money to RMI or other climate-focused organizations?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think that IRA, and quite frankly, just the stage we're at in terms of, clean energy deployment, like really does require philanthropy to be thinking differently about the way in which it operates in the United States. We have a really robust community of very dedicated supporters in this space, But what we're seeing is that a lot of this is about removing the friction in deployment of these technologies and getting them to market in a way that's, quite frankly, like unprecedented, right? We haven't done a scale up on the order of what we have been, what we need to do. And we're really now at that position and that point in time where we can do it, right? It's very like similar to the RMI model, right? Think, do, scale. We've been thinking about things like this for a long time, and we've been demonstrating them in different places. But what IRA gives us the capacity to do is actually scale them. But there are barriers to scaling them, right? And so I do think that working in coordinated ways to make sure, on one hand, we are not experiencing frictions or cost overruns. Like, listen, IRA is actually taking place in a period of time where we're seeing cost increases across the board for commodities of all walks and shapes and sizes, right? Like, it's a difficult time for us to be thinking about really ramping up the deployment of these technologies and thinking about supply chains. And so we really have to think about what are the barriers that are going to exist to being able to deploy these technologies as quickly as possible, and how do we address those, working in partnership with, business partners and philanthropy as well. I think the second piece is, a huge part of this, Bill, is about manufacturing and industrial provisions. And even on this call, like, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about that as much as, what I think is going to be like a fundamental change in the nature of US industry. And so what are the things that we need to be sort of tackling together to make sure that that's a good transition? And I think industrial emissions is a new area for a lot of people. We've certainly experienced that in the work that we're doing, through RMI and our partnerships in the industrial emissions area. And so, really thinking about like, what are some of these new challenges that we're going to have to tackle together? And I think that that's going to need to be an ongoing partnership between RMI, other actors, and the philanthropic community.
Great, thank you so much. We have so many more questions, but I'm really committed to having us close on time. So thank you all so much for all the insightful questions and discussion. And if you submitted a question and we didn't get to it, please email develop@rmi.org. We also have jotted down some of the questions that have come through, and we're really happy to follow up with you on your question. We appreciate everyone's time and attention today, and we hope that you leave feeling as inspired as we are about the IRA, and hopefully a bit more informed. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, RMI's work is only possible with donor support. So this will be critical to our success in implementing the IRA and helping us to make the most of this moment. So if you like what you heard, please consider making a gift at rmi.org/give. And a really special thank you to our Solutions Council members who give $1,500 or more annually, our Innovators Circle members who make gifts of over $25,000, and our Legacy Society members who have included RMI in your estate plans. You are really helping us to power this critical work that we do. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.